Good evening. Day one of the brand new social credit government with its massive majority. And the man in charge took a big step today to divest himself of one of his portfolios. I'll tell you why after Steve has given you the rundown.
The morning after, NDP leader Bob Skelly is in Port Alberni meeting the press, and he says the fight was unfair.
Clearly, the number of seats in the legislature is completely out of proportion with the popular vote, and I guess that's an example of the gerrymander that's taken place in the province over the last several years.
Meantime, Premier Bill Vander is having breakfast with the media in Vancouver, and he's having second thoughts about managing the province's bank accounts himself. Here's Jack.
In fact, he stated that when he appoints his new cabinet, he will be relinquishing the portfolio as finance minister. So that you will understand this, I'm going to show you the major part of my interest with him on the possible conflict of interest, aired here just 4 days ago. But let me now be specific. What positions do you hold in the present government?
I am the Premier and the Minister of Finance for the time being.
Right.
All right.
What position does the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce hold with the government in the form of doing business?
Well, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce isn't the only bank that does business with the government, but it happens to be probably the main one to do business with government.
Right.
In that they handle the daily accounts.
What loans do you, and I'm saying you because we know what we're talking about,
company
have with this big financial institution which depends on the government for much of its business?
Well, it's all done by debentures, and it's properly done. It was done before I became the Premier and the Minister of Finance, and it amounts to, I think, perhaps in the order of maybe, guessing a bit, but $5 million.
$5.7 million, correct?
Yes, could well be that.
And you, you're the Premier of Finance dealing with this bank, and you're Premier and Minister of Finance, would a bank dare to call the loan of the Premier or Minister of Finance were he to get into a problem?
Well, they're not dealing with the Premier directly or the Minister of Finance, number one. They're dealing not with Bill Vander directly, number one. They're dealing with the business, and they have debentures from the business, and all the payment schedules and everything is properly laid out. Now, there isn't a business in British Columbia, at least I don't think there are too many this day and age, that don't owe money from time to time to some financial institution. You can't be in business and not owe money at some time.
But, sir, you don't seem to realize you are the Premier and you are the Minister of Finance.
Yeah.
And you and your interests have to make payments of about $600,000 a year on those loans.
That's
correct. Is that correct?
That's probably just about right.
Okay, you're the open government man. What kind of cash flow do you have to meet $600,000 a year?
Well, that's not open government, that's open business. You'll have to ask Lillian in all fairness, but still, the business will do sufficient cash flow to make those payments, obviously, or the loans would not have been granted. It's not that easy to get money from a bank this day and age. But, Jack...
You don't accept my definition of a conflict of interest, whereby the appearance of the public office holder may benefit is a conflict of interest, and a serious one.
I have said already that if I thought there was a conflict in any of these areas, I would obviously move it out. And if the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce became, if it was perceived to be too much a conflict, or a conflict for that matter, I would have Lillian make other arrangements, no problem. That can be done. But I don't really foresee any conflict of interest. What you're in effect saying...
You don't think there's one now?
What you're in effect saying is that if you're a businessman, there's no place for you in government because there's bound to be a conflict.
No, I'm saying you're the Premier and you're the Minister of Finance, and you deal with this big banking institution in your official capacity and in your private capacity.
Well, I've been dealing with the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce since 1962. And I don't know how long the government's been dealing with the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce.
Let me give you another one, because when you're on the floor of the House in government, as you hope to be, you, said Webster, predictably, are going to be plagued by the opposition, asking you each and every month if you've made your payment to the government bankers, in some ways, the CIBC, of $50,000. Don't you realize that?
Well, I appreciate that, and it'll all be dealt with through the accountants. I certainly won't be doing that. I'm too busy running my affairs in the government to be involved with the business. Obviously, I won't be there. But I can appreciate what you say about the extension and all of the rest, and perception, too. But, you know, it's sad this day and age that the Jimmy Pattersons of the world obviously could never become involved in politics, even if he wanted to, and even if the populace wanted to see the guy lead the province because he's a good businessman. He couldn't do it because he must deal with a dozen banks. I'm just a little guy, but I deal with one bank. He deals with a dozen banks.
You've had conflict of interest under the previous administration, Waterland et al., perhaps. Let me put it to you when you're selecting your colleagues. Would you put in as finance minister a colleague who owed the CIBC $5.7 million? Would you not say, oi, that's a conflict. He could be influenced by that loan. That big loan is all of his family fortunes are in that. Would you appoint a colleague as finance minister if you knew he owed the bank $5.7 million?
Well, I suppose...
I mean, for the pure, all things are pure. And
yeah.
please forgive me if in any way you think I'm not questioning your personal integrity.
No, I appreciate that. And I guess perhaps the question is fairly put. But it depends on, you know, if there was within the government a business person that really had success and extensive business involvements, now offered himself to be in government, was a candidate, a good candidate for the Ministry of Finance, would I exclude that person simply because he's got successful businesses, which in itself means that he's obviously dealing with banks. I don't think I could exclude that person simply because they've been successful in their business.
If I were a social creditor and a successful businessman and I were elected with you and I owed the bank $5.7 million, you would think twice before you made me Minister of Finance.
Well, but there's more than you owing the bank $5.7 million. Obviously, well, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't...
Don't you think that one day, I mean, nobody's suggesting that you, a successful businessman, should now turn around and dispose of your assets at a fire sale. But people will also say to you, look, hey, he's talked about decentralizing the agricultural land reserves. Maybe that land will become a lot more valuable, and then you'd be in a conflict of interest, wouldn't you?
But you know, you can extend this forevermore.
Anyway, I've asked the questions, and you're prepared to be plagued by the opposition.
Well, what I'm saying is it's all open. I'm prepared to make, as I think everybody should, everything available. No blind trust, where it's sort of hidden away, but instead everything out on the table, and people can look at it, and if there's a perception of problems, they can act accordingly, and I know the media will be watching it, as will the members of the opposition. But if there is a problem, I'll unload whatever it is that presents a problem.
Today, the Social Credit Party put on a media brunch at which Mr. Vander was available for questioning. So now that he has the mandate and is going to form a new cabinet, I asked him a question related to this conflict of interest. And here is the question I put to Mr. Vander. When you form your new cabinet, will you surrender the finance portfolio so that your apparent conflict of interest is at least one step removed?
Yes, I don't see really any difficulty with it. On the other hand, if the perception or there's some view in the eyes of perhaps a number of the people that there could be a conflict, I will be removing myself that additional step.
From the finance portfolio?
From the finance portfolio.
Thank you, sir. And a little later, another reporter asked him to clarify that, and he said, yes, I will relinquish the finance portfolio in his cabinet shuffle, which means in this case the formation of his new cabinet. Now, many people may well disagree with my attitude and with the concept of a conflict of interest, an apparent perceived conflict of interest. But it's a matter which must be raised, because you might well say this means, as Mr. Vander says, no businessman who borrows money from banks dare ever go into government. It seems to this reporter that by announcing that he is going to drop the finance portfolio, he does in fact acknowledge that there is a section of opinion which believes that there is a clear perception of a possible conflict of interest, and he has taken one step away from the fantasy garden loans. He is, of course, to be complimented for his move. But the question remains in my mind, as Premier, is he not still in a possible conflict of interest by borrowing from one of the government's principal bankers. Well, we're going to come back after the break with a couple of little items from the Social Credit Convention, and then we're going to go for a free-for-all. Take it away. That's my first major victory over Vander. This was the kind of night when I used to go home when Margaret was alive. She said, "I hate you." Got somebody into trouble, and you think that's great. Oh, she used to get so mad at me.
I know. I remember how mad she was the day I was doing her makeup and you fallen asleep with a chair. She's bitching about how you always fell asleep watching golf.
Well, it was quite an election with 49-point-odd% of the votes. Social Credit got 49 seats. With 42.2, the NDP got 20 seats. The Libs nearly came up to 7% of the vote. So, predictably, and for some reason the NDP is saying it was a redistribution which gave the Social Credit government this unbalanced representation in the House. I'm going to phones. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes.
I wanted to comment on your perceived conflict of interest. What you're doing, and just what Mr. Vander said, is by saying that a businessman who deals with a bank, and whatever bank he would deal with, he's going to have a perceived conflict of interest because he's in business. And it doesn't matter what bank he deals with. I'm sure that just about every major bank in BC deals with the government on some matters. But to brand, and that's what you're doing by saying that he has a perceived conflict of interest. A conflict of interest only exists if there is a conflict, and the fact that he is borrowing from a bank and is in government does not necessarily mean there's a conflict.
Well, I would respectfully disagree with you, which is why I opened the phones tonight, because I've made my point perfectly clear. I think that as Minister of Finance, dealing with that bank with which he is so deeply involved in his personal fortunes is an apparent classic perceived conflict of interest.
Okay, so now he's resigned from, or he is going to resign from the finance portfolio. Now, then after you said that, your last comment was, is there still a perceived conflict of interest?
Perhaps I could...
And so what you're saying is that no businessman can be a member of government because every businessman has a loan.
Classically speaking, that is not quite correct, but I see your point. But I will say this.
Let's face it, if you're going to continue this, if this continues on, and I understand the Sinclair-Stevens thing, I understand that when a problem exists, then that should be accounted for as a conflict of interest. The fact that you borrow money from a bank does not all of a sudden brand a conflict of interest. What you're doing is saying a person has a conflict of interest before anything has created that conflict.
I said to Mr. Vander on the original program that no one is suggesting he have a fire sale, but I think in the position of Premier of the province that it's a much more delicate situation than if I own a department store and I go into government and all I have to do is to tell my department store, do no business with the government, and I am clean.
Yes, but you see, the department store will have a loan. And that loan, if I'm Premier, even though I do business with the government, even though I stop doing business with the government, I still have a loan with the bank. Therefore, in your comments, you're saying then there's a conflict of interest.
No, I'm saying this is an especially delicate position, but you've put your views very well. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I think that Mr. Vander.
Carry on. What happened? I didn't cut him off. No reason to cut him off. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. I tried to get on your show last night. The lines are too busy, or should move into prime time, maybe.
This is
The point I wanted to bring up is I think you're hounding Mr. Vander Zalm to death on this issue, and why don't you just let the man run his business, let him get on with running the province's business, and to the NDP gerrymandering issue, I think they're full of beans. Social Credit would have whipped them anyway without those seats.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. Thanks. I just want to say something a little off the topic here. I've been involved with the Social Credit Party and with the current election, the past two, and my thoughts were that with the third largest margin in terms of a victory over NDP this time around, and 7 years experience and experience in insurance, law, and others, is it time, or is it not time for Angus Reid to receive a cabinet post? Your thoughts, and your thoughts maybe on other possible candidates for a cabinet.
Angus Reid has not particularly distinguished himself, I believe, as a backbencher. Who knows who will be in the cabinet this time around? Mr. Vander Zalm's going to have a tough time. He lost 9 or 10 of his old cabinet ministers. He's got 30-odd new members in the legislature. They're not all Social Credit. And today he announced he's going to hold a class for the new boys and the new girls, as I recall Premier Bennett doing after his victory in 1975. So his cabinet selections will almost of necessity, except perhaps for Kim Campbell, have to come from the older guard. I predict fearlessly and without favour that Campbell, as a woman, despite Mr. Vander Zalm's somewhat antediluvian attitudes to women, they kind of equal my own attitudes, I think that Kim Campbell will probably finish up with a cabinet post. But other than that, he lost McClellan, he lost Secretary the Labour Minister, but he can find another Labour Minister.
Yeah, he lost Gardner.
Gardner, who else was it, the third one?
There was...
Richie, no, there were 3 good House leaders that he lost. Nielsen knew how to run the House, McClellan knew how to run the House, and Gardy, of course, is the expert on running the House, and he's going to stay around in the back rooms for a few months to make sure that everybody knows all the procedures.
Okay, I must suggest, though, that if you say Angus Reid hasn't done much in the House, of course, with the margin victory, it's evident that the people that he represents in North Vancouver are overly pleased with his performance last 7 years.
They're very pleased with it, are they?
Yes.
I'm happy for them. I've never seen his name in the papers much, I'll tell you that. Well, that's beside the point, isn't it? Go ahead from Abbotsford.
Yeah, Jack, I'm surprised that a reporter with your expertise and experience to stoop to the depths of as low as I can think of on this Vander Zalm issue of conflict of interest. I can't believe what I hear you saying in the last couple of days. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think it's about time, Jack, that you and your good friend Monroe bought yourselves a mirror. Go sit somewhere in Hawaii and look at yourself in the mirror all day, Jack. It's just the lowest thing I've ever heard of.
Well, you are wrong.
And the way you've attacked this guy, I mean, if you could see yourself on these tapes, you wouldn't believe what you're saying.
I see myself all the time on these tapes, old boy, although I don't particularly relish it. If you cannot accept the importance of perception of conflict of interest, you have absolutely no understanding of how a democracy is
properly run. You have no understanding of business. We finally got a good businessman. We finally got somebody that's going to open up the government to guys like you, and then you go and start treating them this way.
Well, I'll say this in his favour. He certainly won't start closing it down again, although, mind you, in private business he doesn't want to talk to me about that, and I don't blame him, but I'm entitled to ask the questions, and I'm not going to lie down and be trampled over where I think there is a question of philosophy and recognition of perceptions of conflict of interest involved. After the break. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack, I would like to look ahead a little bit to the next election, and I'm utterly fascinated by the fact that the media has crowned Mike Harcourt heir apparent to Bob Skelly. Outside of Vancouver, until the media got a hold of Mikey, I don't think anyone was really that familiar with him or his policy or platform, if he has one. In my opinion, Mike Harcourt has done nothing but vote against everything that had to do with modernization of Vancouver. He fought the government every inch of the way on SkyTrain Expo, whatever new things have come along, and all of a sudden Mike Harcourt is going to save the NDP party.
And he endorsed Harry Rankin.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but then I think Harry's carried the council all along. Mike's just sat there and nodded. You know, through the last 3 years or 4 years that I've been watching, I watched the council meetings on television. I've never seen the man make a decision.
I can tell you, Mike probably feels today, I tried to get him on the program tonight, but he did have other legitimate commitments. He wasn't trying to dodge me. I would have asked him straight up, you know, but when he was asked straight up last night's and today's coverage, he said he was not prepared to stab Skelly in the back. David Vickers was beaten, however, in Victoria, another potential leadership candidate, but I will tell you quite seriously, I think there are many rumblings within the NDP right now to consider a leadership move.
Well, I'm sure that there are, but as I say, outside of Vancouver, until the media decided that Mike Harcourt was a logical successor to Bob Skelly, I really doubt whether very many people knew who he was or would have assumed this. Now it's the automatic thing, well, Harcourt's going to take over from Skelly.
Not necessarily. Thanks very much, my dear. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. I'd like to first of all congratulate the Flying Dutchman. The people spoke, and he was there, and he's our new leader.
Yeah,
And as far as him giving up his portfolio as finance minister, you know, let's not kid ourselves. Don't you think for 1 minute that direction will be coming down from the premier to the finance minister as to what happens in that situation?
Well, of course he will, and I think that's perfectly valid and proper. And I complimented Vander Zalm on apparently, in my opinion, acknowledging the fact that there is an appearance and a perception of a conflict of interest.
Yeah, but Jack, you also made mention of that, you know, he has to answer this every day, like they're going to be sitting in the House as a conflict of interest. I mean, let's face it.
He'll get nagged to death on it.
But by the same token, though, if the NDP, if the opposition, if they had a brain in their head, they'd be in business the same way for themselves, but they don't. Again, I'd like to congratulate a small businessman that became a big businessman. Let's run this province as a big businessman can do it. Like he mentioned, Jim Patterson, for example, cannot step into politics because of conflict of interest. I mean, here's a man that took and made Expo, put Vancouver back on the map again where it belongs.
There are ways to avoid
his business ethics.
There are ways to avoid conflict of interest, but I take your point, sir. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Bye. I knew who that was. Recognized the voice. Mind you, I've spoken to 10 million people over the past 30 years, and some voices stick with you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. I just wanted to say that Mr. Skelly is looking for all kinds of excuses why he lost, but he just needs to ask me. I can tell him.
Why did he lose?
His foot in his mouth.
You mean washing socks in his mouth?
Yes, too many times. The same thing that Dave Barrett did. People don't want to be run by the unions and pay double welfare, and he did it himself.
Okay, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Mr. Webster.
Good evening.
One of the things that disturbed me most about this last election had to do really with 1983. And at that time, I found that I felt seriously that the social credit government misled us. And I happen to feel that people have a right to know what's going to happen beforehand. And if that trust is broken, I happen to feel that the government, any government, should not be allowed back in.
You're talking about Bennett keeping his mouth shut in restraint and then bringing in that package of draconian bills.
Yes, basically. And then, secondly, after all these issues come in, I thought they were rather fundamental, basic issues. And I don't think any government has a right to change basic issues like that without first discussing with the electorate.
Well,
again, I think the social credit government should have been not elected because of that.
Well, of course, they were not hampered by Bennett's lackluster record because of the fact that they found Bill Vander's Emmett Whistler, and he came along, as you must concede, like gangbusters.
Certainly.
And so therefore, he's not running on the social credit record. In fact, I asked him a question today which made it very clear that he has not really committed himself to any of the promises that were talked about during the campaign. Everything's up to Treasury Board.
Yeah. I'm just trying to distinguish between Bill Vander's and the Social Credit Party. I think the Social Credit government, at the last time, did something they should not be allowed to have done. They broke it. I think they broke a very basic trust with the electorate.
But there's only one way to punish them, and that's to vote them out. And they were voted in handsomely. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack.
Yes.
I would just like to say that gerrymandering that the Union Democrats claimed made a difference in the election. Without it anyway, the social credit would have still won 38 seats to 20 or 19. And one question about your coverage last night. How could the computer declare a candidate already a winner when it was only like from one box from a whole bunch?
Don't ask me, but don't ask me, but they were right on that.
Okay.
Okay, it's just beyond me.
All right, thanks.
I'm from a different generation. Got time for one more call? No, I don't. 15 seconds. Tomorrow night, we are preempted by a football game. But we shall be back for sure. What's the next day? Monday with Webster, just ahead of the Newshour at 5 p.m. precisely. Stay tuned for Tony.